Do you love books? Do you wish you could hear some insights straight from the author themselves? Join Sam Hankin, your host, as he interviews top-selling book authors and dives into interesting and unforgettable discussions here at The Avid Reader.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of The Avid Reader, brought to you by Wellington Square Bookshop. Our guest today is Ben Yagoda, author of Gobsmacked, The British Invasion of American English, published by the Princeton University Press. It was released just a few days ago. You can find Ben at benyagoda.com and Not One Off Britishisms, that's one word, Not One Off Britishisms.com. And his podcast series is The Lives They're Living, which is it's studies of lives of important folks who fly under the radar of our lives, but he kind of opens a window to their lives that we probably would never figure out ourselves. So we regularly use words that are really French, like cafe, ballet, encore, rendezvous, even like chef. And then in Italian, we use words like prima donna, stanza, scenario, sonnet. Spanish, we use patio, plaza, mosquito even. And Latin, which is where everything started, alibi, agenda, vice versa. But we also use English words that derive from English words, or as Ben explains, British words that have or are about to be assimilated into our everyday parlance, like gobsmacked, or bespoke, or brilliant, or slightly more pretentiously, if you will, gone on holiday, curated, full stop. And as George Bernard Shaw may have said, and Ben said this a couple of times on his various shows, we're two nations divided by a common language. And Ben's book shows us how, in his life, he's kind of straddled two continents etymologically. So I could give you a quiz, but you probably already know many of the words that Ben discusses without realizing that you've kind of absconded with them. It's funny, if we were to adopt or steal words from other languages more frequently, we might find ourselves living in a de-Babelized world, if you will, speaking and writing a more Esperanto-like language. So here to explain this, doesn't sound right, leaking of words across the pond, is our guest, Ben Yagoda. Hi, Ben. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks so much. I'm delighted to be here. And I like that idea of leaking. That's a metaphor I hadn't thought of, but it's pretty good.
Oh, thanks. Well, and you explain this really well in the beginning of the book. Why don't you just set the stage and tell us, how did all this come about, your interest in it, not only the book, but its precursor, the website?
Right. Well, yeah, that website, as you mentioned, Not One Off Britishisms, I started in 2011. And the origin story is that I, for a long time, was a professor of journalism at the University of Delaware. I just retired a couple of years ago, but I was starting in the 90s, I taught there, and I started leading study abroad classes to London. And one of the classes we had was the British press, which was fascinating and fun because of the tabloids and the very different press culture over there. But while I was there, this was in the 90s, I started reading a lot of these newspapers and magazines and began to realize that I really wasn't aware of how big a difference that's separated by a common language idea, the terminology for all sorts of different things were between Britain and the US. I mean, when you watch a kind of stage Englishman, he'll say, turn on the telly and take the lift and where's my bumbershoot, which I later learned is not really a British word, even though a lot of Americans think it is, but just a dozen or so that are well-known, Cheerio and things like that. But there are hundreds and hundreds of other words that they use, just as we have our words that are common in America that aren't used in Britain. So I began to notice that and was amused by it. But then the odd thing that happened was a few years later, late 90s, early 2000s, I started to notice the British words being picked up, especially by American journalists and writers. And eventually it became such a phenomenon that I started that blog in 2011, charting those things. And I must have done 1,000 entries by now. It was picked up. It attracted a lot of interest, in part because it was contrary to the story that one often hears in Britain and has been for over 100 years, which is that Americanisms are polluting the purity of the English British language. So even now, just a couple of weeks ago, there was one of these articles in the Telegraph about how terrible it was, and that people say French fries instead of chips, and and cookies instead of biscuit, and how people say it's so awesome because of the vulgar Americanisms. And when I started to write about it going the other way, the Brits were like, wow, they were gobsmacked by that idea. They were amused by it. And it got picked up. It was written about in the BBC and the Times of London. And this blog, which is still going on, has gotten well over 3 million page views on this very narrow, obscure topic, which is kind of funny. One of the first ones that I often use as an example, and when I say this to young people, they look at me kind of funny because they don't believe that it wasn't always an Americanism. But it's the phrase "to go missing." A person who was kidnapped went missing, or you might say, my wallet went missing. It sounds very common now, but in fact, it really wasn't used in the US at all before around 2000, and actually is fairly new in Britain. It came up in the late 20th century. But now it's a commonplace. Kerfuffle, gobsmacked, spot on. The more I start looking into it, the more and more of these words appeared.
You know, it's funny that you mentioned periodicals and then you mentioned gone missing, which is an interesting beginning, kind of tragic one, the way it started. But a lot of these words seem to have come across from periodicals, newspapers. So the first time that gone missing, even the first time I think you saw it, was with regard to that. What was her name?
The Chandra Levy disappearance. Yeah, I mean, I wasn't aware of it at the time, but when I looked, because nowadays with all the databases, Google Books, New York Times, .com, and many other ways of tracing back the history of use of words, it became apparent that really started to be used in America around the time of the disappearance of the congressional intern Chandra Levy, who was tragically later found killed. But my sort of hypothesis was that this was such a big story, and it was right before 9/11. It was pushed off the headlines by that in 2001. But there was so much interest that journalists don't like to say the same word again and again and again. And they come up with alternatives, synonyms, what Fowler called elegant variation. And to say disappeared or vanished so many times just wasn't working. And those words also were kind of inadequate. They have a little bit of a feel of a magician's act, you know, my assistant will vanish into air. And it turned out that one of the first, if not the first use I found, and I wrote about it in the blog, was in USA Today. And I was later contacted by the writer of that article who said she was fascinated to see that. And she had grown up in Britain and moved to the US. So it was familiar to her. So it seemed like she was a bit of the typhoid Mary who brought Go Missing to the US. And it really served a need. And a lot of these terms are better than the alternative we have, or really serve a purpose. And this one does. And it's caught on like anything.
Yeah, and it's funny. It's, as you said, vanished has one connotation. Gone missing has this type of suspicious or portentous type vibe to it.
Yeah, it does.
I don't know why, but it does, because it's two simple words, gone missing, but it still gives you this idea, something's afoot.
It's also
And
more active. I mean, the vanished, like I say,
right,
it's like the magician, the person's been just sort of snatched up and vanished into thin air. The go missing has a sense of the action to it. So it's a little bit more evocative.
yeah, definitely. You're talking about sources, and this was price. This was worth the price of the book for me was Ngram on Google, and I started using it. Explain it, if you will, because you can explain it a lot better than I can.
Yeah.
Because I think a lot of your readers and my customers at the bookshop will be fascinated by it.
Well, I do say I believe in the book that it's the greatest time suck I've ever encountered in my life, and it certainly is. Um, yeah, it's a website, and if you can find it if you Google the two words Ngram, that's one word, Ngram, viewer. And it's something that the Boffins, which is another Britishism, meaning the sort of smart people over at Google, put together. And it grew out of the Google Books enterprise, in which they have digitized and made searchable pretty much every book ever published. You can't read all of them because of copyright law, the ones that are more or less 100 years or newer, you can't read, but they're all in the database. And on the Google Ngram viewer tool, you can throw into the search field any word up to five or phrase up to 5 words, um, like plastics. So you can put in plastics and compare it to metal. So plastics, comma, metal will produce a graph from whatever date you choose to start, 1800 to the present, that shows over time the relative popularity of both those words. But wait, there's more. You can also key in go missing in British books compared to go missing in American books and some periodicals as well that they've digitized. And you could have this handy dandy graph that shows you it started out in Britain, America started a couple of decades later. They both grew. In some cases, America surpassed the British use of it. In some cases, they're still catching up. And so it produces these graphs, and for the book, I got a really talented illustrator named Eric Hansen to do illustrated versions of these graphs that I think are quite attractive.
They are. It's really interesting because I guess on the x-axis, you can see the frequency, but it's always a tiny, tiny number, or generally. And then the smoothing function is really interesting.
Right.
Yeah, that's very helpful. I didn't, at first I'm looking at these 4 lines going across, and then you smooth it and you get a little more variation.
Right. That, for the expert users among the listeners, when they try that, they can play around with the smoothing. Yeah, it's great. And the x-axis, that's the vertical one. Is that right? Yeah. I always get those confused. What that shows you, to be technical for a minute, is so if you're searching plastics, it shows the x-axis shows you the percentage of times plastics is used compared to all other words. So it's like, 0.0013, but
Yeah, right.
still showing it over time shows the relative climb or fall, and compared to other words, it shows you. So that particular number isn't of much use. It's the trend is really the thing that's helpful, and it's kind of amazing to play around with.
Yeah, and you can always just slide the decimal point over 3, and you still get the same idea. Yeah, it was fascinating, and it was helpful actually in me researching the book, because I went off. Oh, well, yeah, one of the words that the interview you did with Grammar Girl, I guess a few days ago, probably.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and you talked about like the portmanteau word, like smog,
Yeah,
and that was an interesting one. And I always thought it was Lewis Carroll, because he loved portmanteau
he
words.
did. Yeah, not that one.
He did chortle, which is chuckle and spit.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Very, very good. Yeah. Yeah. Smog. Not sure what put me onto it, but it's one of these things that is an unusual word. So you can search it. I mean, you can go to Google Books and the Times of London database and other corpora, which is the word for the repository of words, and you can date it to the first use. And it was something in about 1903 or thereabouts that a British scientist just gave a speech and said, I have invented the word smog. It's a combination of smoke and fog. And it was appropriate for London at that time. Decades later, it caught on in the US for cities like Los Angeles and Pittsburgh before they got cleaned up. And now, if you look in Ngram Viewer, I would imagine it's at least as popular in the US, if not more so, because it's completely been adopted here. Brunch
Yeah.
is a similar one. That was university slang. The British are really, really into slang. And the folks at Oxford and Eton made that up in the late 1800s for a meal that's a combination of breakfast and lunch. It was brunch. And again, about 3 or 4 decades later, in the 1920s and the 30s, it started getting picked up in the US.
Yeah, that was what was interesting. And your interviewer in that Grammar Girl YouTube video, she was saying, "Oh, I thought that was, I didn't know that. I thought that was always American, smog and brunch." And she said brunch was such a useful word, which it is. But I think most Americans would just think, "Hey, yeah, that's our word." And that's what I, in the introduction, so trying to think, it is the English language, but should we just be saying we speak American, they speak British?
Hmm.
So I went,
Well, probably not, because it's fun to talk about these words that have gone from there to here and the words that have gone from here to there, like awesome. But the fact is, the vast majority of the vocabulary is shared. It is not different. So it's fun to talk about the differences, but I think they both deserve to be called the same word for English language. They're variants, they're dialects, with some interesting differences, but basically the same language.
yeah, it's like you and me in Pennsylvania. If you want a Coke, you say it's soda. Half the country is pop, but I think there's
Right.
another one. And there's lots of dialect things like that. And it's interesting that you describe it that way. But there are which you also got into in the last YouTube interview, there are those words that you jokingly say might be a bit pretentious, like going on holiday.
My favorite one that's well, let me ask you, if someone is a graduate of Penn State, um, you would say about that person, they went to blank at Penn State. What would you say?
I would say they went to college. And
I
I
would
wouldn't,
say they went to college too. And in fact, traditionally, every Americans would say they went to college, because that is the way it's just been said, even though Penn State is a university. In Britain, though, they don't have that distinction between colleges and universities. Here, they're both 4-year institutions. The university has graduate programs. College like Lehigh or Swarthmore, where I live, doesn't. But they don't have that in Britain. In Britain, you say, I went to university when I was at university. And I've seen in the last maybe 10 years or so that being picked up in the US. And not to cast a value judgment, I would call that pretentious. Um, you know, it, Now I'm sort of thinking about that. On the other hand, when these things get to be so popular that it's in the air and someone just picks it up, they're not being pretentious. They're just saying what they've heard. Going to university hasn't quite gotten to that stage yet, but it might. Whereas the Brits would say it might do. That's one of the things they uh, say in terms of their verbs that has not really caught on here, except in Utah, but that's another story and probably not worth getting into.
Yeah, I guess it, well, but at Oxford and Cambridge is within the university, they do have colleges. At Penn
Right.
State, they have School of Architecture as opposed to the
Right.
college. I've never really thought about it that way. But yeah, I mean, it actually sounds pleasant, gone to university rather
Yeah,
than gone.
right. It has that, and
Yeah,
that's, pretentious is a harsh word. It sounds classy. The Brits have been saying these things for a long time, and they definitely have a way with language. Shakespeare, after all, and it's tempting. It's fun. It's fun to throw around these words, and that's one of the fun things about language. I mean, British English, we use the word dialect, and uh, sports and Wall Street and African American and hip hop and all these things, youth slang that I sometimes pick up things from my daughters who are young adults. It's fun. It's fun to play around with that stuff. If everybody talked and wrote the same way, things would be pretty boring.
yeah. There's like my stepdaughter. There's words like bet, which means definitely, sure. There's words
Okay.
like there's words like word. Like if you say something, she goes word, which means yeah, you're right, true.
Okay, I would have thought that might be a little outdated because whenever I bring a new slang and I say, this is so cool to my daughter, she says, yeah, that's what people were saying 5 years ago. Good, she pats me on the head. Good for you. You finally, as the Brits say, you finally twigged to that. So there's a little bit of a lag time.
Yeah, there's another one, slay. I like slay.
That's a good one. Yeah, slay.
Slaves. But then they still use words like cool, which is interesting how cool can last for decades and decades. And that's from beatniks.
Yeah, beatnik, and well, they took it from jazz.
Yeah, right.
Jazz really created a lot of it. Of course, African American language. Yeah, cool is a word that's big time staying power. That, for whatever reason, is pretty clearly not going to go away. And
Yeah.
it doesn't sound, old fashioned. People of all ages use it. Now, of course, you know, 15 years ago, I think, thanks to Paris Hilton, that's hot became a sort of thing. That seems to have, well, gone away a little bit. It still seems to be a word that's used about someone who's, as the Brits would say, fit for sexually attractive. Fit.
Really?
That's the word they use. It's not really been picked up here. Yeah, she's pretty fit. Hots is still, it seems to me, used for that.
I think fit might be a one that the kids are using now. Everybody's a
Okay.
kid to yes. It's funny, even the word jazz, that may have even more interesting origins that we really couldn't even talk about.
Well, that's a word that I'll tell you. I'm on a email list for the American Dialect Society, and there's just in the last couple of days been a contentious back and forth about jazz,
Really?
where it came from, when it was first used, what it signified. Did it come from African languages? That's one that's going to be debated and discussed and researched for a long time, for sure.
Yeah. And sticking with jazz, it's like the saxophone. I mean, I don't even know where that came up from. I have no idea.
The word saxophone?
Yeah.
I think it was this guy who invented it, Adolf Sax, I
Oh,
believe.
really?
Yeah,
That's a good one.
you could look
Um,
it up.
we'll look it up. That's the other thing with AI now. All of this can be looked up in the derivations.
Yeah, of course, AI, I don't know if they've gotten any better, but it was, at least at first, prone to these so-called hallucinations where it would tell you, like I looked up myself and it said, Ben Yagoda graduated from the University of Michigan. It wasn't true. And, I said, that's actually not true. And they said, oh, I'm sorry. And then they had me graduate from the University of Iowa, which also wasn't true. Sometimes, at least in the early days, which is a Britishism, when you'd catch a mistake, they would kind of double down and go for a more outrageous mistake. Probably that's gotten better.
I find that, in order to get a good answer from ChatGPT or whatever you use, you have to be able to frame the proper query. Query is a good. Am I adopting a pretentious Britishism by saying query?
I don't think so, or at least not to my knowledge. I think that's been around. I couldn't tell you for sure, but that's been definitely commonly used for quite a while in the US. So,
And so you go ahead.
well, I was going to say a word I just used that uh, my book was excerpted the other day in The Guardian in Britain, and people can look up Ben Yagoda and Guardian to see a little. They have a thing called the long read, so they had a nice big chunk of the book that was published in their online edition that you can read for free. But I got an email from somebody who was very angry about Americanisms, a British person, and the one that got him the angriest was the word gotten, Gotten. And he said, why can't you just say got? The British say, over the course of it, we would say he had gotten hungry. They would say he had got hungry. And in fact, that's the older form. The British changed from gotten to got. They still say forgotten, but they don't say gotten. And this offended him so much that we would use those extra 3 letters in what he thought was an unattractive word that he wanted me to justify that. I might answer him. I have not yet, but that's a word that the Brits get very upset about.
Yeah, I tend to, and he's tending to look at it grammatically, and I find that, well, now that pretty much everyone I know communicates by text, and emojis become words. There was a survey that said if you don't put an emoji on your response, the other person assumes you don't like them, and I don't use emojis. And if you don't put you put an exclamation point after gobsmacked, which is interesting. And Grammar Girl said that made the book title really punchy. Had you not used it, that would be perceived in a different fashion. And that's the way when you thank someone in an email, you have to put an exclamation point. Otherwise,
yeah. I mean, you've touched on something that's very interesting to me, and the book I'm working on now is a book about irony, kind of a history of irony. And there's been a lot of research on just this topic. And in fact, my daughter, Maria, who I mentioned, we were texting back and forth and said, what restaurant are you going to meet at? And she named a restaurant, and I said, okay, period. And she said, don't you want to go there? So yeah, I said, okay. So, well, the period sounds sarcastic, ironic, passive aggressive. You're not. So it's either an exclamation point or 2 exclamation points. 3 exclamation points might sound a little overeager, or what is the norm, what I've learned is nothing. So an emoji or nothing or an exclamation point for the final sentence. If it's a 2 or 3 sentence one, you can use periods after the first and second. But for the final sentence, the default is no punctuation.
Exactly. I'm not going to give into that. I really am not.
Good for you.
I have a friend, and we've been arguing about irony for 20 years, which is kind of ironic. And never come up, you can go to the Greek situational dramatic irony, but that's not what it is today. And then you go to Alanis Morissette's song, Isn't It Ironic?
Right.
Which every example is not irony, which in itself is ironic.
Arguably.
Yeah, arguably. Exactly. Arguably. So you give me the definition of ironic as it's used. Well, one of the Greek definitions would be, the 3 of us, suppose there's a third person here talking, and the 2 of us know something about you that you don't know. That's considered a type of situational.
Or in a play or movie where the audience knows something that's considered dramatic irony. An interesting thing about irony is that it was not used about situations or dramatic irony until 1833. That was the
Really?
first, a guy invented that. And I wrote an essay about this for LitHub that you can find. But this guy named Connop Thirlwell, who was an English classicist and scholar, invented the idea that a situation could be ironic. Now, there were ironic situations before that in Greek drama, Oedipus, as you say, but it wasn't referred to as irony. He was the first guy to do that. Up until that point, the only sort of irony, the only thing that the word irony was used about was verbal irony. So making a point like Swift's A Modest Proposal, by making up a character who says stuff that you don't really believe, or saying, this weather sure sucks when it's the most beautiful day you've ever seen. Something different from or opposite from your meaning. That was the traditional form of irony. And Socrates was considered Socratic irony because he pretended to know less than he really did. So I could talk a lot about that, but let's get back to the Britishisms.
Yeah, this is not selling your book, Ben.
Right. Well, we got to sell those units. I'm telling you. Yeah. And yeah, here it is at your local, in Exton or anywhere where
you get your you should come by. You could come by. No one does signings anymore because they do these. But yeah, you could come by. We could, yeah, I'm sure we could get a bunch. Before we leave irony, it becomes almost a political thing because, like, if I say to you, I know a dentist who got a cavity. Half of the people will say that's irony. Half of the people will say it's not irony if they're smart at all. Is that ironic?
Well, so the idea of an ironic situation is just it's not like aluminum that is a real thing that you can do a test on and find out what it is. It's a thing that people have decided to call by a certain word. So sure, it could be. I mean, Alanis Morissette, that's a little bit of an easy target, like rain on your wedding day. No, yes. That's pretty clearly not ironic. That's unfortunate. But you could say just the fact that he got one cavity, probably not, because that's pretty common. But you could work into the thing about the dentist with tooth problems, and that could be legit irony. That could be done.
We could do this for hours, so let's get back to it. You were right the first time. You've talked about the British being irritated at some of the Americanisms that have been adopted in their country. When you were writing the book, well, do you actually have any of your own thoughts about particular ones that either delight you or irritate you?
Yeah. I think some of those ones that we mentioned, like on holiday, we've got the perfectly good on vacation. So there's no need to bring in on holiday, which the British say for vacation. Things where there's, a perfectly good equivalent, university, going to college, I find a little annoying. Try not to get too worked up about it. Try to be more scientific about it. And the ones that kind of delight me and give me pleasure, well, I have to say a lot of the profanity. They're very good at it. The insults and profanity. If you want to say the headphones that you bought are really bad, and you adopt the Irishism and say they were shite.
Correct.
That's very pungent and gets the idea across. Calling a stupid person a pillock or a numpty. The Brits have a real, or saying that's a load of codswallop. I think throwing and I've got a whole chapter on, I call it insults and the naughty bits, because they say bits instead of parts. Throwing some of those in can really make your language or your speech more colorful in a fun way.
Another type of, and I wouldn't call it a Britishism, although it sounds like, I practice law, and when you go to England, of course, there's barristers and solicitors, and barristers are the ones who trial. But I notice in depositions, a lot of lawyers like to do something like, at this juncture, or in in point of fact.
Okay.
And I've never done that because at this juncture simply means now.
Now, you're right. Yeah,
And point
I would probably guess that that's less a Britishism than just trying to
of pompous.
use as many words as you possibly can. Although, it's interesting. So I keep doing this blog. I mean, I just did one today on another Irish term like gobshite. It's also an insult, calling someone an Egypt, Eejit. I did that today. But one that I have my eye on, I actually feel like I've seen Americans use the word solicitor for lawyer or attorney, which is meaningless here, right? Because in Britain, one of them is the one who appears in court. Is it the barrister or the solicitor? And the other one does the rest of the work. It doesn't really make sense in our system, but I feel like I've come across recently some Americans referring to the solicitor. So I'm going to research that and find out what the deal is.
Yeah, solicitor in the United States would be more like almost like a notary, a scrivener, a clerk.
Okay. And there's, official political jobs, a solicitor general, I think I've seen, but not for a person's lawyer. But I'm going to look into that.
Hey, so as we conclude, and it's always a good way to conclude with an author, is you're talking about your next book. So why don't you tell us what your next book's going to be about before we say goodbye?
Well, you know what? Actually, my next book is not the irony one. The next book is a book that I've completed. That's my first novel. And it's a historical novel about the writer O. Henry and his years in New York in the first decade of the 20th century. And
Look at this. I just
yeah,
picked it up.
well, it's funny because his name got applied to that prize story. Meanwhile, he is critically considered, sort of a lowbrow entertainer. But yeah, his name's on there, and I just am about to sign the contract, and that should be out in about a year.
I'll pick that up the first day because he only wrote for like 12 years. He died penniless, and no one he was an alcoholic.
He did not die penniless. He died quite ill from cirrhosis from his excessive alcohol consumption. But as you say, he only wrote for about 12 years, from 1899 till his death in 1910. But within 4 or 5 years after starting, he was the most successful short story writer in the country at a time when the short story was like, the Netflix series of the time. It was the most popular form of narrative, and he was at the top of the world. He was pretty amazing.
There's so many people that come into the bookstore, and I tell them, this is really good, this short story collection. They say, I can't read short stories. And I love short stories.
Yeah, I agree. It's funny how, the sort of notion is that people have short attention spans, which would seem to be an argument for short stories. But yeah, I have that sense as well, that people are not that into them.
I have no idea why. It doesn't make any sense. People love the episodic Netflix series, like you say. They love them.
Right.
That's, I guess, a different thing because you have a cliffhanger and then you end up binging it. So that's different. But
the one short story collection which I haven't read, but a number of people I know seem to like it a lot, was that guy Amor
Towels. Yeah.
Towels. And that's his latest book is I don't know, short stories or novellas, long stories, and people seem to like that quite a bit.
Yeah, he wrote Rules of Civility and A Gentleman in Moscow, which is now a really nice TV series. Should be a movie, but they've stretched it out into a long series, which I guess makes them more money. Anyway, I could prattle.
Not sure. Don't have a sense of it as a Britishism. It's a good word. But You can go right now after we talk, go into Google Ngram Viewer and search for American versus British prattle. I'll do the same. We could both do it and find
Okay.
out.
I'll email you back. Yeah, it's funny because, like I said, it's usually my last question, but I'm really excited about O. Henry because, like I said, I reached back before the interview and just started reading the O. Henry Awards, which is quite a coincidence. And then the second one is
But is it ironic?
Damn it.
I'm going to say no. I'm going to say no. Not ironic.
It's a coincidence.
Coincidence, exactly.
And it's not unfortunate. It's a but the other one is it'll be interesting to read the book on irony because I'm hoping you'll solve the puzzle for me. Because it's like and that would be ironic if you did. Okay, I'll let you go because you've had enough of me, I think.
Well, I feel like we could go on for quite a bit, but maybe listeners have had enough.
My bookstore is right above a bar, so we could have a drink.
Sounds great.
Okay, look forward to talking and seeing you.
All right, thanks so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of The Avid Reader. If you liked today's episode, check out more of our content on our channel.